I used it, and my husband, and I'm so sorry I ever used it.
I've been doing mandrakes for like 28 years now.
Methamphetamine use is rife across South Africa. And while official numbers are hard to come by, it's thought that the country might have one of the highest per capita rates of crystal meth use on Earth.
Sadly, there's a huge demand for the drug in Cape Town.
Because of its history of apartheid, South Africa has developed one of the most chaotic and misunderstood drug scenes in the world, with people there taking different drugs in radically different ways. This is the wild story of how meth took over South Africa, and how this may have ultimately been caused by a secret weapons program run by the old apartheid regime itself. Methamphetamine has spread like wildfire across South Africa, sold under the street name Tick, and concentrated heavily in poor and marginalized communities. But unlike in the US, Europe, or Japan, where amphetamines have a decades-long history, Tick in South Africa is a relatively new drug, only gaining widespread popularity over the past 20 or so years. The origin story of South African tick is one of the wildest in the entire history of the war on drugs. In fact, to understand the story of meth in South Africa, you have to start with fish. This is abalone, an endangered species of shellfish native to the oceans around South Africa. It's also considered a delicacy in many East Asian countries, particularly China, where it's thought to act as an aphrodisiac.
There's a lot of poachers in South Africa that poach abalone. So they poach abalone and they sell it to the Asian people, Japanese, Chinese people.
In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Chinese organized crime groups began working with South African fishermen, poaching abalone for export to Hong Kong and mainland China. It soon became easier for these criminal groups to pay for the abalone in methamphetamine and its precursor ingredients. Precursor chemicals for synthetic drugs are a huge, semi-legal grey market economy in China. And it's often simpler for crime groups to create barter economies and trade chemicals for wildlife than to ship large amounts of cash across the world.
The world has taken to abalone poaching in South Africa. The dangerous business goes hand in hand with drug trading.
In the South African context, we had fishing quotas that were held by families who'd been fishing for a couple of generations, and these were lost after the fall of apartheid because big conglomerates took over the fishing quotas and then got rid of the traditional fishermen. These communities became very disenfranchised and started doing what they knew best how to do, which was catch fish and abalone and crayfish and sell it on the illegal market because they didn't have quotas anymore.
The first waves of so-called Chinese meth were created using precursors supplied by the Chinese crime groups and cooked in makeshift labs by South African gangs. This was the birth of Tick, homegrown South African meth, which became popular in the Western Cape region and then spread out over the rest of the country.
The last few years, more than 11% of South Africans have addiction problems, and despite government's best efforts, many succumb to the drug lifestyle.
However, as the market for Tick has developed, it's attracted competition from other international criminal groups. First, Mexican cartels reportedly set up meth labs in Nigeria in collaboration with local organized crime networks. These Nigerian trafficking networks have been bringing vast quantities of this purer, more industrial-grade meth into South Africa.
The recent violence was reportedly sparked by an alleged drug dealer shooting and killing a taxi driver. This has degenerated into diplomatic tensions between the two Africans' biggest economies, Nigeria and South Africa.
Since around 2019, an even newer player in the tick business has emerged, Afghanistan. Using chemicals derived from the ephedra plant that grows there, Afghan traffickers have begun producing methamphetamine on a massive scale. And this new plant-based meth has also been flooding into South Africa.
Cartels from Afghanistan are believed to be targeting South Africa as a new destination. The syndicates are using Mozambique to ship hundreds of kilograms of crystal meth to South Africa.
Originally in South Africa, we had Chinese production. Then we have also seen Mexican methamphetamine coming in, typically coming down through Africa and in through the ports in South Africa. And then more recently, we've seen methamphetamine coming down from the Middle East in the heroin shipments as well. Law enforcement can do very little about controlling the drugs entering into the country.
Interestingly, it was an entirely different drug, also created with Chinese precursors, that paves the way for the tick explosion. Something almost uniquely South African, the smokable Quaalude.
I've always been fascinated by methaqualone. a drug that was once sold in the United States under the brand name Quaalude. I analyzed some samples and was surprised to find they contained not only methaqualone, but also a formulation sold under the brand name Mandrax.
Quaaludes were a prescription sedative that became popular on the 1970s American party scene because they made people feel kind of dreamy and kind of turned on. But in the early 1980s, they were banned and all but disappeared across the world, until they suddenly made a dramatic comeback in the late 90s in South Africa under the street name Mandrax.
Methaqualone or Mandrax or white pipe is one of the drugs that has been in South Africa for a very long time. It's the old Quaalude that is smoked in a bottleneck with cannabis. So you've got this drug, which is essentially a very strong sleeping tablet, and then you've got this stimulant that comes in as well. And the two went hand in hand.
This was the drug that first created the connection between South African abalone poachers and the Chinese suppliers of precursor chemicals, which would later form the basis of South Africa's methamphetamine boom.
Now, it's ready to go to the freezer.
Do you ever trade the abalone directly for the Mandrax?
Yes, with the Chinese guy.
Abalone business, 50-50. Sometimes nice, sometimes bad.
Gonna make a lot of money on the street now.
Then it became a tool because it's really difficult to move cash across borders. Much easier to actually move chemicals across borders than cash. It couldn't meet the needs of the Chinese trying to acquire all these poached fishing products, and so they had to find something else, and methamphetamine was the perfect response to that.
And this is where the story gets even more wild. Why did South Africa in the 1990s, uniquely among any country in the world, experience a Quaalude revival? The answer is thought to lie further back in time with the apartheid regime itself.
Demonstrations against the South African government's strict apartheid policy.
Mandela could have left South Africa before he was caught. Instead, he chose to stay with his people.
During the 1970s and 80s, the apartheid government in South Africa operated an illegal chemical weapons program called Project Coast. The head of that program was this guy, Wouter Basson, who allegedly tried to develop race-specific sterilization techniques and poisons to murder anti-apartheid activists. One of the programs Project Coast worked on was the idea of using various drugs as crowd control to deter anti-apartheid uprisings.
The methaqualone was one of the substances that was manufactured with the intention of crowd control. Now, if you think about it, you cannot fly over them and disseminate the methaqualone over the crowd. But possibly you can start by getting the crowd hooked on methaqualone. And if they are hooked on methaqualone, that very same crowd will become a more docile crowd.
As part of this clandestine program, Basson created tons of MDMA and Quaaludes. And one way or another, those drugs found their way into South Africa's cities and townships.
The previous apartheid regime had this project called Project Coast, which was headed up by Wouter Basson. And what the intention was to destabilize communities using drugs such as methaqualone and MDMA and try and disrupt the youth and stop people from organizing themselves into political opposition. And so we had this methaqualone coming into the market, and it set up a drug trade in amongst the gangs in the local communities as well.
Did you ever suspect during that period when you were first learning about Mandrax distribution that the government could have been involved?
It was obvious. There was no way. It was too big a project. The only name that's put with Mandrax in South Africa is Basson. No other names put to it. There was no way it could have hit the streets at that magnitude. They had to use black hands.
Though Mandrax has now largely been replaced by tick on the South African drug scene, there are pockets of the country where it's still popular.
I closed it. I waited until it reached the temperature.
And are you worried about the fumes? Should we get away from it now while it's cooking? You know that this is toxic. It's not good for you.
When I go to the toilet, there was blood.
There was blood in your urine.
Yeah.
You know it's known to cause bladder cancer.
Blood cancer?
Bladder cancer.
Okay.
While secret government drug programs and trading exotic seafood for meth precursors may seem like a uniquely South African story, there are underlying patterns here that are more universal. Problematic use of tick is concentrated in poor and marginalized communities, and attempts to control the trade through law enforcement only makes the problem worse. pushing people towards harder drugs, enriching organized crime, and driving corruption. As unique as the story of South African meth is, the key problem here is the war on drugs itself.
We'd like to congratulate drugs for winning the war on drugs.